This is the demo of the Parity Trust Fund invoice financing platform. So what we have here is the parity workflow for the invoice or supply chain financing. From the vendor or the seller workflow, the seller submits an invoice. The invoice is pre-approved by the anchor customer, whose invoices we get into the platform from their ERP system. It is done either through an API or through normal Excel upload. So once we have these invoices, the seller can go ahead and request financing for any of these invoices and get a quote for the invoices from the financer. And then once the financing is done, uh, the seller will basically get the money, and the anchor, instead of paying to the seller directly, will pay through the escrow account. The entire process is done through an escrow account. So the financer pays to the escrow account, of which we take the money and then pay back to the seller. When the anchor finally pays the invoice, instead of paying to the seller directly, they will pay the escrow account, which we will distribute amongst the financer as well as the seller as well. So that's how the entire transaction happens. In this demo, we have three users: the buyer or the anchor customer, whose login ID is there. Then we have the seller or the vendor. And lastly, in the bottom, we have the financer. All this will interact through the Parity platform. The Parity platform basically has an admin and as well as the escrow account details. So everybody will basically keep transferring money into the escrow account. So let me jump into the demo. What I have here is the Parity Trust Fund platform. So first I'll go ahead and log in as the buyer to show the origination of the invoices. So if I see here, I have logged in as this buyer at hyperchain.in, and if I see here that this buyer currently does not have any invoices. Now this part of the system is where we integrate through the buyer through their APIs, or they dump their daily invoices into a particular folder and we pick up from there. Right, so we get the daily list of buyer invoices from their ERP systems. For the purposes of this demo, we will go ahead and upload a invoice. So I'll just show an Excel which basically has the details of, let's say a few invoices that the buyer has for a particular day. Right, so we have the date, transaction number, bill number, credit period, etc. All the tax amounts, all these details are available. So we will go ahead and upload this particular invoice. And if you see here, these has the supplier names are there: vendor, vendor 5, etc. So only when vendor logs in through their account, they will see the invoices that belongs to them. So if you see here, we have already uploaded these invoices and they are currently in the buyer approved status. Obviously this process, as I was mentioning, is not a manual process. It will be done automatically from the buyer systems. We will pull the invoices out. Now we are logging in as the vendor. And this is the vendor dashboard where they can see their already approved invoices, or they can even upload new invoices by mentioning the buyer. The system works in a way that a vendor, buyer, and a financer are connected. So here we see that we already have the list of the pre-connected buyers in the system. So if I click on fetch invoices, I can see the invoices that have been fetched for this particular buyer, that have been uploaded by this particular buyer, in fact. And the vendor can go ahead and take any one of these invoices and then request for funding. So if I click on finance, I see that the financial institution has already been decided. This is because of a pre-agreement that we have between the buyer and the vendor combination. So the financer can go ahead and give interest rate for a buyer, or for the vendors of a particular buyer, or even for a buyer-vendor relationship. We'll showcase that when we actually log in as the financer. So here we have the details of the invoice. The holdback amount is essentially 20% of the invoice, which will be paid only after the buyer pays back the full amount of the invoice in the escrow. The invoice minus the holdback is the loan amount, and the loan is applicable for this many days, which is basically the tenure of the invoice. And there are certain disbursements to the vendor, which involve certain cost that is being calculated by the platform. So once the vendor goes ahead and agrees on it, we go ahead and select and proceed, and we also put in a stamp duty state. The stamp duty state is essentially if there's any stamp duty implications, then the platform will go ahead and pay the stamp duty. And here we ask the vendor to actually upload the soft copy of the invoice. So we are uploading a demo invoice that we have here. And once this is done, we click on save, and the invoice is essentially now going and sitting inside the database, and it is basically being verified against all the details that has been entered. Here we have the form of facilitation notice that is auto generated, and the vendor has to accept this form of facilitation notice, go through a final review of all the details that has been provided, and then go ahead and click on apply. This concludes the part of the vendor where it is only a step of around a couple of minutes where they select an invoice that they want financing against. They have pre-approved offers, so they go and select one of the pre-approved offers and then apply for financing. Right. And now the financing has to come to the vendor. So what are the next steps of the process? So I log out here and then log in quickly as the admin of the system. So once I log in as the admin, I can see that there is one invoice where the request has been submitted. I can go ahead and click on the details of the invoice. As you see, there are more details available to the admin, and this is the entire calculation and the ratios that are available. So I go ahead and verify the invoice. I go ahead and look at the businesses that are involved. I go ahead and look at there's no transaction as of yet, the activities that has happened, and the overall documents that have been uploaded along with. So this is the basically the invoice document. Once I verify all these details, I go ahead and click on approved. Once this is approved, it will go to the financer with which we have a pre-approved offer. I'm logging out now and logging in as the financer of the system. So here we are in the dashboard of the financer, and here we see the same invoice has now traveled into the work basket of uh, the financer here, and it is approved by buyer. So the financer can go ahead and click on this invoice and see the details of the invoice. This is a pre-approved buyer and vendor combination. So once he goes ahead and sees the details of this invoice, he can go ahead and click on the stamp duty state and the financing types. The financing type may be supply chain financing or factoring, depending on whether the financer wants to go through either one of the processes. Here, the financer that we have using for the demo is actually an NBFC, so we are going through the supply chain financing process. So once the financer verifies, they can go ahead and click on approve, which means that the invoice has been accepted for financing. The next step after this is to go ahead and actually finance the invoice. So to finance the invoice, the financer will essentially go ahead and pay the margin money of the invoice into the escrow account. So this payment will happen in the LMS system of the financer. But what they will do here is they will go ahead and upload the data, including the payment proof, in the system. So uh, we go ahead and actually assume that the financer has paid the invoice. If this upload of data does not happen within 1 business days, then we can actually move the invoice into a marketplace where we actually share it with multiple others financiers in the system, and they can go ahead and actually give a bid on that invoice and finance it. So with respect to this payment details, here we are asking the financer to enter a transaction ID and the date of the financing. Let's say the bank name that has been used for financing, the transaction amount which needs to be financed based on the calculations, and any comments. And if they have a payment proof, the payment proof needs to be uploaded here. There are certain documents like the AOD and the DPN that are basically being accepted here. Now, the key question is, how does the financer go ahead and give rates for anchors or vendors, or even an anchor vendor combination? So here we have logged in as the financer, and then here we can see the connections. And when we see a connection here, we see that the financer has given a particular rate for this buyer, right? So we can go ahead and check the rate details that are there. So the interest rate yearly is 17%, the margin money is 20%. This is the amount that will be held back. The minimum usance period, that is the minimum days for the invoice, or the minimum loan period, is 30 days. Minimum invoice amount currently is 0. I mean, we can put in a value here. Maximum loan exposure for this business, delayed rate additional percentage, and delay applied after this many days. So if the invoice is delayed by the vendor, by the anchor for payment, then there might be a delayed rate applied, and the delay will be applied after certain business days. So we can even add an interest rate for a vendor or for a buyer, or even for a vendor buyer combination here through the system. Right. So we are in a state where the financer has claimed that they have actually financed the invoice, and they have uploaded a payment proof. So from the admin perspective, we can go ahead and actually verify those details. If you see here, this invoice is currently in the financer claims payment made status, which means that we know that the financer has claimed through a payment proof that he has made the payment, but essentially we still don't know if the payment has arrived. Now, how this works here is that we go ahead and actually connected through the escrow account, and when we are connected through the escrow account, we will go ahead and get all the transactions that are coming in the escrow account. Once we get the right transaction, we will go ahead and upload this into the status of the financer paid initial. So this will happen automatically through the backend with a live system. Right. So this is essentially the demo here. So the next parts of the demos are where we actually go ahead and follow up with the various parties here. So there are certain statuses that needs to be handled with respect to the financial initial payment. Then after the financial has made the payment, we will go ahead and make a payment through the escrow account to the vendor, right? And before that, we will deduct the platform fees from the financer side, or the platform fees from the vendor side. And finally, at the end of the invoice, after 30, 60, 90 days, when the buyer makes the payment, the buyer will also make the payment into the escrow account. And there we will go ahead and actually go ahead make the final payment, which is the margin money payment, back to the financer after deducting the interest rates. And then after deducting the interest rate, we'll go ahead and make the final payment out of the 20%, whatever is the interest rate, we'll make it the payment to the vendor directly. So these are the steps of the process that will happen directly based on the transactions happening in and out of the escrow account. So this is the overall demo. So we showed that we had three parties involved in the system, and these three parties are interacting. The invoices are pre-approved by the buyer, where we actually integrate with their ERP. The vendor can go ahead and just request for a invoice financing within a few minutes. The financer can go ahead and select the pre-approved invoices and go through the financing process. The entire process is pretty simple. Thank you all.